Elizabeth stepped into the upscale restaurant with the grace of someone who had been through battles far greater than anything that could be thrown at her. The cool evening air followed her inside, a gentle breeze that didn't quite match the tension building in the room. Her Parrot, a colourful companion who had travelled with her to many important meetings, perched on her shoulder, silent but ever watchful. The staff behind the hostess desk shot glances at her, their curiosity barely contained beneath their practiced smiles. It wasn't unusual for people to stare, and Elizabeth had long since learned to ignore it. In a world that often reduced her to her skin colour or her age, she had grown used to the discomfort of others. They would stare, whisper, but she had learned not to shrink back. She never did. "Table for one?" the hostess asked politely, though there was a hint of hesitation in her voice as she noticed the Parrot. "Yes, please," Elizabeth replied with a calm smile, her voice as polished as the fine silverware that gleamed from the nearby tables. She was aware of the sudden shift in energy. The room had quieted in a subtle way, as if people were holding their breath, unsure whether her presence belonged in such an establishment. But Elizabeth didn't flinch. She had been in much more dangerous rooms than this, had faced much harsher scrutiny than anything this restaurant could provide. The hostess led her to a window-side table, the gentle hum of whispered conversations now mingling with the soft clink of silverware. As Elizabeth settled into her seat, she felt the eyes of the other patrons on her. It was a familiar feeling, one that she had never quite gotten used to. A glance here, a raised eyebrow there. She saw the discomfort, the unease, and it made her stomach tighten. She would not be bothered by it. She was here to enjoy a quiet dinner, a small indulgence she allowed herself after long, grueling weeks in the political arena. A young waiter approached, his eyes flicking nervously to her Parrot before meeting her gaze. His uniform was immaculate, his posture straight, but his eyes betrayed something less than welcoming. Elizabeth sensed it immediately, like a prickling on the back of her neck. She had dealt with prejudice in more overt forms, but this was different. This was a subtle, insidious form of judgment, one that made itself known in the small gestures, the avoidance of eye contact, the forced pleasantries. "How can I help you tonight?" he asked, his tone professional but laced with something she couldn't quite place. Perhaps it was indifference, or maybe disdain. "I'll start with the soup of the day," she replied evenly, trying to keep her voice neutral despite the growing tension in her chest. She ordered quickly, deciding to avoid the discomfort of lingering too long in conversation. His eyes flicked to her Parrot again, and she could almost hear the judgment in his mind. "A Parrot? Here?" He nodded curtly and turned to leave without a word, the edges of his uniform swishing behind him. Elizabeth watched him go, a wave of frustration sweeping through her. She had encountered this before, this subtle marginalization. The moment a person like her entered a space meant for the elite, there was a ripple, an invisible barrier that pushed her aside, made her feel like she didn't belong. But she was no stranger to this feeling. It wasn't new. What was new, though, was how palpable it felt today. The weight of their judgment pressed against her, as though the room itself had decided she was an intruder. As the waiter returned with her soup, he placed it down with a sharp, almost dismissive movement, avoiding her gaze entirely. The small details were becoming impossible to ignore. His hesitation, his reluctance, the way he carefully made sure not to let their hands brush as he handed her the spoon. "Is there anything else I can get you?" he asked, his voice now colder, as if she were a nuisance. Elizabeth forced a smile, the corners of her lips twitching with the effort. She could sense the tide of anger beginning to rise inside her, but she held it in check. Not yet. She had learned a long time ago that the battle would come in its own time, and when it did, she would be ready. But for now, all she had to do was sit there, poised and dignified, in the face of someone who had decided she was less than. She was used to this sort of treatment, but something about the way he dismissed her, it made her blood run cold. This wasn't just about a single moment. It was about the weight of generations of prejudice that hung in the air, invisible but suffocating. The waiter moved to leave, but not before glancing at the Parrot once more, his gaze lingering just a moment too long. It wasn't just that he saw her as a woman who didn't belong. It was the Parrot, the symbol of her identity, of who she was, that made him uncomfortable. There was something about this moment that felt more loaded than the last, as though it were a tipping point, a turning point in something much larger than a simple dinner. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a chair scraping against the floor nearby. She turned just in time to catch the glare of a woman at the next table. her lips pressed tightly together, her eyes narrowing as she saw Elizabeth seated with the bird. "Really?" the woman muttered under her breath, her voice just loud enough for Elizabeth to hear. Elizabeth stiffened, her pulse quickening, but she did not rise to the bait. Instead, she focused on the soup in front of her, trying to center herself. This was her life, a constant push and pull between the world that saw her as a symbol of power and the world that still wanted to tear her down simply because she existed, because she was black, because she dared to occupy space in a place where she wasn't wanted. She could feel the woman's eyes on her back, still watching, judging. She could feel the tension thickening in the air, suffocating her. But she would not flinch. She would not give them the satisfaction. Not today. Not ever. When the waiter returned to clear the soup bowl, he dropped it with an almost indignant clatter, his hands shaking slightly as he tried to retreat from the table. Elizabeth caught a glimpse of his face, flushed and embarrassed, as he scurried away without so much as a glance. He had underestimated her. They all did. But Elizabeth would make sure he never forgot this moment. As she sat there, her parrot watching her with unwavering patience, she knew something had to change. The world would not simply allow her to sit quietly in the background. She had fought too long to be invisible. She had fought too long to be dismissed. And as the weight of the room's judgment pressed down on her, Elizabeth's resolve only grew stronger. She would not leave this restaurant beaten, humiliated, or unheard. The world may have thought she was just another elderly black woman with a parrot, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. They had no idea that she was one of the most powerful political figures in the city, a woman who had shaped policies, who had fought and won battles that many believed were lost causes. They would learn soon enough. The door to the restaurant slammed open, and a fresh gust of wind rushed through the room, as if to clear the suffocating tension. Elizabeth stood up slowly, her parrot perched confidently on her shoulder, her eyes sweeping over the room one last time. This wasn't just a dinner, it was a message, and she wasn't going anywhere. Elizabeth's steps were slow as she left the restaurant, her heels clicking rhythmically on the polished floor. The cold air of the evening wrapped around her as she stepped out into the street, the city lights flickering like distant stars in the evening sky. The weight of the day, the subtle but ever-present racism, hung on her like a heavy cloak. The incident with the waiter, his dismissive attitude, his deliberate avoidance of her, had unsettled her more than she was willing to admit. She had expected some level of prejudice in a high-end establishment, but the way he had treated her with such open disdain had been different. It was an ugly reminder of how deep the divisions ran in this city, divisions she had fought against for decades. As Elizabeth made her way to the car parked at the curb, she reflected on her years of navigating the complexities of power and influence. She had spent so much of her life fighting for equality, pushing back against the systems that sought to keep her and people like her in their place. She had been called many things, an activist, a troublemaker, a voice for the voiceless, but none of those titles had ever bothered her. It was the silence, the disregard, the thought that people like her didn't belong in spaces of power that made her blood boil. The evening was cold, but Elizabeth didn't feel the chill as much as she felt the sting of the words and actions she had endured in the restaurant. She could already feel her anger rising again. How many times had she faced situations like this? How many times had people tried to diminish her, to make her feel like she didn't belong? But every time she had stood tall, she had fought for a place at the table, and tonight the struggle was no different. The car door opened and she slid into the back seat, her parrot still perched on her shoulder, its feathers bright against the dark fabric of her coat. The driver, a young man who had worked for her for years, glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his eyes scanning her face as he waited for her to speak. "You all right, Mum?" he asked gently, his voice a soft contrast to the tension that had gripped her since she left the restaurant. Elizabeth took a moment to collect herself before she responded. She had become skilled at hiding her emotions, at putting on a mask of composure when the weight of the world threatened to pull her down. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady. "It's just another day, another reminder of the fight we're still in." Her driver nodded, understanding without needing any further explanation. He had seen the toll it took on her over the years, the way her face would harden whenever she encountered that familiar, ugly prejudice. He had seen how, despite everything she had accomplished, there were still moments when it felt like the world was determined to reduce her to nothing. As the car drove through the streets, the city began to feel like a maze. The buildings loomed over her, massive and impersonal, symbols of the power that ran everything. But Elizabeth knew the truth. Power was only ever lent to those who could manipulate it. It had never been given freely to people like her, no matter how hard she worked for it. The higher she climbed, the harder the climb became, and the more she had to fight to keep her place. Back at her office, as the door to her car closed and she stepped onto the elevator, the weight of the world felt heavier than ever. Her assistant, Emily, was waiting for her inside, her face a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Elizabeth, we've got that meeting tomorrow with the Committee on Racial Equality, right?" Emily asked, flipping through her notes. "They're expecting some new proposals, aren't they?" Elizabeth took a deep breath, brushing a hand over her face to push the remnants of frustration away. "Yes, they are, and I plan on giving them exactly what they need. But tonight we have something else to focus on." Emily raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Elizabeth turned and looked at her assistant, her expression now calm, but the fire still simmering beneath the surface. "Tonight we're going to take a stand. I'm not letting this slide. Not anymore." Emily's eyes widened slightly as she realized what Elizabeth was suggesting. "You're not—" "Yes," Elizabeth interrupted, her voice cold with purpose. "I'm going public. They need to understand the cost of treating people like this. And they will." The next day, the news broke. Elizabeth Montgomery, known political figure and advocate for racial equality, had made a public statement condemning the treatment she had received at the upscale restaurant. She detailed the actions of the waiter, highlighting his condescending attitude, his dismissive actions, and the lack of respect shown to her during the course of her meal. But Elizabeth didn't stop there. She framed the incident as a microcosm of the larger issues that still plagued society. Issues of race, class, and systemic prejudice that continued to shape the everyday lives of millions of people. Her statement went viral almost instantly, making its way to news outlets, social media platforms, and even political debates. Elizabeth's words were powerful, filled with an anger that she had carefully controlled for years, but now allowed to pour out in full force. She was a woman who had lived through the subtle and overt racism of the world, and now her voice would be the one to break the silence. "The truth is," Elizabeth said in her video statement, her voice steady but filled with conviction, "we are still fighting an invisible enemy. It's the prejudice that exists in the hearts of those who think we are less than them. It's the kind of racism that makes people believe that a black woman with a parrot doesn't belong in a fine dining restaurant. But it is not just me. It is everyone who has been made to feel small, insignificant, inferior." She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. "This is not just an attack on me. It is an attack on all of us who have been marginalized, discriminated against, and treated as if we don't deserve a place at the table." The video spread like wildfire. People began to comment, to share, to amplify Elizabeth's voice. Her followers, her allies, and even some who had once questioned her, all rallied behind her. The restaurant's name was dragged through the mud, its management forced to issue a public apology. But it wasn't just about the restaurant. It was about the larger message, about holding people accountable for the harm they inflicted, knowingly or unknowingly, on others. The waiter, Mark, was swiftly identified and fired. Public outrage was swift and unforgiving, but Elizabeth's response was measured. She had never been one to revel in the downfall of others, even when they deserved it. She had faced enough humiliation in her own life to know the sting of judgment all too well. But this wasn't about revenge. It was about showing the world that actions have consequences. As the fallout continued, Elizabeth found herself at the center of a media storm. People were talking, debating, and discussing the larger implications of what had happened. But for Elizabeth, this was just one more battle in a long war. The fight for equality, respect, and justice wasn't something she could fight alone, but she had made her stand, and now the world was listening. Mark, the waiter, may have thought that a simple act of disrespect could go unnoticed, but he was wrong. The world had changed, and people like Elizabeth were no longer willing to let small slights slide. They would no longer be invisible, no longer be silenced. As Elizabeth sat in her office, watching the story unfold, she couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. But it was fleeting. The work was far from over. The fight for dignity, respect, and equality would continue, and this time she was determined to win. The days after Elizabeth's statement passed in a blur of media coverage and public discussions. News outlets ran endless articles, many of which debated the incident from all angles. Some voiced support for Elizabeth, lauding her for standing up against the blatant racism she had experienced. Others, however, did not share her sentiments, and it quickly became clear that her stance was causing waves far beyond what she had anticipated. The restaurant's management, already under fire for their treatment of Elizabeth, issued a public apology almost immediately. They claimed they had conducted a review of the situation and had acted swiftly by firing the waiter, Mark. But Elizabeth wasn't satisfied. The apology felt empty, almost as if they were simply trying to distance themselves from the scandal, rather than address the systemic problem of racism that had been exposed. The backlash started to gain momentum. The restaurant was flooded with negative reviews, but in the midst of the outrage came a different kind of comment, a kind of backlash Elizabeth hadn't expected. Some people started defending the waiter's actions, claiming he was simply doing his job, that he was entitled to treat Elizabeth however he saw fit. These comments, rife with racist undertones, began to flood social media platforms, adding fuel to the fire of division. Some questioned Elizabeth's motives. They accused her of playing the race card or exaggerating the situation. "She's just an entitled politician who thinks she's above everyone," one comment read. Another person chimed in, "She's just looking for attention." It was frustrating. It was exhausting. But Elizabeth had been in the political arena long enough to know that when you made waves, not everyone would be on your side. What bothered her most was that this was not the first time she'd been forced to confront this kind of reaction. Every step she took, every inch of ground she gained in her fight for racial equality, had been met with resistance, with hatred, with the kind of silence that so often accompanies prejudice. She had spent decades battling against a system that wasn't designed for people like her to succeed, but this felt different. This felt personal. This wasn't just about policy anymore. This wasn't just about fighting for better laws. This was about her dignity, her worth, her very presence in spaces that were never meant for people like her. It wasn't long before the vitriol spilled over into her personal life. Unfamiliar faces began to show up outside her office, at her home, on her social media pages. People who had never spoken to her before, who had never shown an ounce of interest in her work, suddenly had a lot to say about how she should carry herself, how she should be grateful for any attention or privilege she received. It was subtle but brutal, veiled racism wrapped in polite language, couched in the tired rhetoric of meritocracy and hard work. The truth, however, was clear. They believed she did not deserve the same rights as they did. Elizabeth wasn't surprised. She had faced this type of treatment all her life, but it was the reminder of how pervasive it was, the fact that it never really stopped, that it followed her even into her hardest-fought victories, that made her bones ache with frustration. She had never been one to back down, and she wasn't about to start now. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just a few ignorant comments. This was about an entire system of oppression that was determined to crush her spirit, to keep her in her place. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her assistant Emily knocking on the door. "Elizabeth, they're here," Emily said, her voice filled with quiet urgency. "The committee, they're expecting you." Elizabeth stood from her desk slowly, gathering herself for yet another battle. The Committee on Racial Equality had scheduled a meeting to discuss policy proposals, but today, the air in the room felt thick with tension. Elizabeth could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her, the murmurs as she entered, the judgment in their gazes. Some were supportive of her work, but many were only there to observe, to watch her closely, to see if she had what it took to handle the pressure of political life. She had seen that look too many times before, the look that said they thought she was a token, a figurehead to be used but never respected. She walked to the front of the room, her parrot still perched on her shoulder. She had grown accustomed to the judgment it brought, the whispers that would follow whenever she walked into a room with it. But this time, as she looked out at the faces in front of her, she felt a strange sense of defiance rising within her. She was done with playing by other people's rules. She was done pretending that this wasn't happening. The world could see her for who she was, and she would never let them forget it. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice steady and confident, though her heart was racing. She could feel the eyes of the committee members upon her, some looking uncomfortable, others skeptical. "I know that the issue of racial equality is not one that can be solved overnight, but if we are ever going to make progress, we must start by confronting the prejudices that exist in our society, not just in our laws, but in the everyday interactions between people. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the room. The incident that happened to me at the restaurant was not an isolated one. It is part of a much larger pattern of racism that permeates our daily lives. The waiter who treated me with such disdain didn't just do so because of me. He did it because he saw me, someone like me, as unworthy of respect, as less than. And this is the reality for countless others every single day. Her words were met with silence, but Elizabeth didn't back down. She didn't need approval. She didn't need validation. She needed action, and she would get it. We cannot continue to pretend that racism is a problem that exists only in isolated incidents. It is everywhere. In the way we speak to each other, in the way we make assumptions, in the opportunities we deny to those who don't look like us. It is in our schools, our hospitals, our boardrooms, and yes, even our restaurants. It is in the way we treat people because of the color of their skin, their age, their gender, or their disability. And it's time we stop pretending it doesn't exist. A few of the committee members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but Elizabeth wasn't finished. She wasn't going to let them off the hook that easily. I know that many of you believe you are doing everything you can, she continued, her voice unwavering. But unless we truly confront the deep-seated bias that runs through this society, our policies will never be enough. We need to address the reality that even the smallest gestures, an unkind word, a disrespectful glance, a discriminatory practice, have a lasting impact on people's lives, and it is not enough to simply acknowledge that it exists. We need to dismantle it. We need to stop tolerating it. There was a long, tense pause in the room. Elizabeth could feel the weight of the moment. Some were nodding, some were silent, but all were listening. A man from the back of the room spoke up, his voice clear but condescending. Elizabeth, we understand the issue, but you can't just go around calling every slight racism. Not every incident is a direct attack on you or your race. Her chest tightened. There it was, the dismissal, the downplaying of her experience. It wasn't a new argument, but it still stung. It was always the same. People who didn't want to face the ugly truth about the systems they benefited from. No, she said, her voice sharper now. Not every slight is racism, but every instance of racism begins with a dismissal, with someone telling the victim that their experience doesn't matter. When you allow this behavior to go unchecked, it spreads, and it infects everything. That is why we are here, to make sure it doesn't continue, to make sure that the people who face this every day have a chance to be heard. There was no immediate response, but Elizabeth could feel the shift in the room. Some were uncomfortable, but some were finally starting to understand. Her voice softened, but the power in her words remained. We all have a responsibility to make this a better world for everyone, not just for those who already have power, not just for those who look like us or act like us, but for everyone. And it starts now, today. She let the silence hang in the room, her words echoing off the walls, heavy with the truth they couldn't ignore. The battle wasn't over. It would never be over. But for the first time in a long while, Elizabeth felt like she had made an impact. The fight was far from won, but it was no longer just her fight alone. The room shifted, and for the first time that evening, there was a spark of something different in the air, a glimmer of hope, a sense that the change she had been fighting for was no longer a distant dream. It was happening, and Elizabeth Montgomery wasn't about to let anyone forget it. Let's take a brief pause here. We'd love to know where you're listening to our story from, and if you've ever experienced something similar in your own life. Your thoughts are important to us, so please feel free to share your comments below. And if you haven't yet, don't forget to subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now, let's continue. The following days after the meeting were a whirlwind of activity. The media coverage continued to pour in, most of it supportive, though not all of it. Elizabeth had expected the pushback. She knew that whenever you spoke out against an entrenched system, especially one as deeply rooted as racism, you invited criticism from those who were unwilling to acknowledge the problem. What had been a simple dinner at an upscale restaurant had now turned into a full-blown national conversation. Everyone had an opinion, and everyone seemed to want a piece of Elizabeth Montgomery. For the most part, she remained calm, steadfast in her resolve, but the pressure was starting to weigh on her. The negativity was persistent. It came in waves, constant, invisible blows designed to wear her down. Social media was flooded with insults. Some called her a troublemaker, Others said she was simply looking for attention. She was accused of fabricating the entire incident, of using her position to manipulate the situation for her own gain. But it wasn't the anonymous trolls on the internet that bothered her the most. It was the people she knew, the ones she had once thought of as allies, who now seemed to question her motives. People who had once praised her work in the fight for racial equality were now hesitant to publicly stand by her. The fallout from the incident, it seemed, had opened old wounds, ones that no amount of success could cover up. As she sat in her office, reviewing the messages and reports from her team, Elizabeth couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. She had spent years building her reputation, fighting for change, but now it felt like everything she had worked for was under attack. The world wasn't just questioning her actions. They were questioning her very right to exist in spaces where power was meant to be reserved for people who didn't look like her. The world was telling her that no matter how hard she fought, no matter how many victories she won, she would always be the outsider, the exception, the token. It wasn't that Elizabeth hadn't experienced racism before. She had faced it from the moment she stepped foot in the political arena. But this was different. This was more personal. This wasn't just a casual remark or a subtle snub. This was a direct attack on her dignity, on her humanity. It was as if the world was telling her that she didn't belong in the spaces where the powerful gathered, where the decisions that shaped society were made. She leaned back in her chair, the weight of the thoughts swirling in her mind, threatening to pull her under. She had always known that the road to equality would be long and difficult. She had always known that there would be people who would resist, who would fight to maintain the status quo. But this was a reminder of just how deep the roots of racism ran. It wasn't just in the institutions, it was in the everyday interactions, the casual dismissals, the microaggressions that slowly eroded a person's sense of self-worth. Her assistant Emily knocked on the door, breaking Elizabeth's reverie. "Elizabeth, the press is waiting for your statement," Emily said softly, her tone filled with concern. Elizabeth nodded, taking a deep breath before standing up. She wasn't going to let them break her. Not now, not ever. She had made it this far by refusing to let anyone define her. She wasn't going to let a group of small-minded people take that away from her. As she stepped into the hallway, she was greeted by a wall of cameras and microphones. Reporters were clamoring for her attention, shouting questions about the incident, about her stance on racism, about the future of the restaurant. Elizabeth could feel the weight of their gaze, but she remained calm. She'd been in this position countless times before, and though she had never liked the attention, she knew how to use it to her advantage. She took her place in front of the microphones, her back straight, her expression composed. "I want to make one thing clear," she began, her voice firm and unwavering. "What happened at that restaurant was not an isolated incident. It is a reflection of the systemic racism that runs deep in this society, a society that continues to value people based on their skin color, their age, and their appearance. We cannot continue to pretend that these problems don't exist or that they can be swept under the rug." She paused for a moment, allowing her words to sink in. "It's not just about one disrespectful waiter. It's about the thousands of individuals who face this kind of treatment every single day. It's about the people who are ignored, dismissed, and made to feel invisible simply because of who they are. And it's time that we as a society start holding people accountable for their actions, for their words, and for the impact they have on others." The reporters were silent for a moment, processing her words. Then the questions began, rapid fire, but Elizabeth answered each one with the same calm, measured tone. She was used to the scrutiny. She had been in the public eye long enough to know that people would try to tear her down, to pick apart everything she said. But she didn't care. She wasn't here to please anyone. She was here to make change. The backlash from the restaurant incident had only fueled her determination. As the press conference came to an end, she could feel the weight of the world still pressing down on her. But it wasn't the same weight. It was the weight of responsibility, the knowledge that she had a voice. And that voice had the power to spark change. She had to use it. She had to keep speaking out no matter the cost. But even as she walked away from the press conference, Elizabeth could feel the shadows creeping in. She could feel the judgment, the whispers that followed her everywhere. She had always been aware of the way people saw her, the way they reduced her to her race, her gender, her age. But now, it felt like the walls were closing in on her. There was nowhere to hide. The attack had come in many forms. but it was the quiet, insidious racism that had left the deepest scars. As she returned to her office, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The sense of unease that had begun the night of the restaurant incident was growing stronger. She had expected to face pushback, but now she felt something more, something darker. The pressure to remain stoic, to hold her ground, was mounting, and she knew it wouldn't stop until she had nothing left. It was then that her phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a message from Emily. "They're starting to target your past. They're going after your voting record, your associations. They're questioning your integrity." Elizabeth's heart sank as she read the message. She had known this was coming. When you became a public figure, you were never truly safe, but to have her entire career dissected, picked apart by those who had no understanding of the struggles she had faced, of the battles she had fought, this was something else entirely. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everything she had worked for, everything she had believed in. She stood up from her desk and walked to the window, staring out at the city below. The world was moving fast, and the forces that had once been in her favor now seemed to be working against her. She knew the stakes were high. The fight for racial equality was never easy, and she had always been prepared for the road to be long. But now, with the weight of public scrutiny bearing down on her, she had to ask herself, how much more could she take? The walls were closing in, but Elizabeth wasn't about to back down. She wasn't going to let them silence her. If they wanted a fight, they had one. If they wanted to see how far she would go, they would soon find out. And this time, she wasn't going to let them win. She was ready to face whatever came next, because if she didn't, she knew that the system would continue to perpetuate the very same injustice she had spent her life trying to eradicate. She would not be broken. Not now. Not ever. The fight for equality was her fight. And she would keep fighting until the very end. The days following the press conference had felt like an unrelenting storm, battering Elizabeth from every direction. The media frenzy surrounding her statement on the restaurant incident had escalated into something much bigger. She had known it was coming. She had expected it even. But nothing could prepare her for the sheer intensity of the backlash. The criticisms grew louder with each passing day, and they weren't just from strangers. People she had once respected, allies in her years of political work, now questioned her motives, suggesting that she had exaggerated the incident for personal gain. As the noise from the outside world became deafening, Elizabeth began to retreat inward, spending more time alone in her office, reviewing proposals and preparing for the next round of public engagements. She had learned to tune out the noise in the past, to focus only on what she could control. But this time, the constant barrage of negativity gnawed at her in ways it never had before. Her reputation was being torn apart by the very same people who once claimed to support her. The insinuations came quickly and without mercy. Articles, interviews, and social media posts questioned her credibility, her integrity, and even her humanity. How could a woman like her, an influential politician, be so thin-skinned over something as trivial as an unkind waiter? Was she truly the champion of racial equality? Or was this just another attempt to manipulate the media for personal attention? Every day felt like an exhausting battle. There were moments when Elizabeth questioned herself, when the weight of the hate and the doubt from the public threatened to swallow her whole. She had worked for decades to carve out a place for herself in a world that wasn't designed for people like her. And now, it felt like the very foundation she had built was crumbling beneath her. But there was something deeper within her, a fierce, unshakable determination that had driven her through years of adversity. The attacks were brutal, yes, but they weren't new. She had faced worse. She had seen how people like her were dismissed, humiliated, and cast aside simply for existing in spaces where they weren't wanted. And as much as the hatred hurt, as much as it stung, she couldn't let it define her. She wouldn't let them win. It was early one afternoon, several days after the press conference, when Elizabeth's phone rang. She glanced at the screen, her heart sinking as she saw the caller ID. It was Emily, her assistant, but this call wasn't about routine business. Something was wrong. She picked up the phone. "Elizabeth, you need to see this," Emily said, her voice tight with anxiety. "There's a new video, one of the protesters from the restaurant incident. It's going viral." Elizabeth's stomach tightened. She could already feel the storm brewing. "What's in the video?" she asked, her voice steady, but her pulse quickening. "It's the waiter," Emily said, her voice almost faltering. "Mark, the one who served you. Someone caught him on camera, and he's talking about you. He's mocking you, calling you all sorts of things. He's even bragging about how he treated you that night. It's bad, Elizabeth. Really bad." Elizabeth felt a cold chill run down her spine as she placed the phone on speaker and began watching the video. The footage was shaky, filmed in the back of what appeared to be a bar, and Mark was standing in front of a group of people, laughing and telling the story of the night he had served Elizabeth. His words were casual, as though he didn't realize the weight of his actions. "I thought it was pretty funny, honestly," Mark said, smirking as he recounted the events. "You should have seen the look on her face when I served her. A black woman with a damn parrot, thinking she belonged in a fancy place like that. She kept trying to talk to me, but I just ignored her, you know? I didn't even want to touch her hand. She's probably some rich politician who thinks she's better than everyone else, but she's not. I showed her her place and she didn't even know what hit her." The group of people around him laughed, the sound echoing through the video as Mark continued. "She's just another entitled person who thinks the world owes her something. I'm not sorry for what I did. I did my job. She didn't belong there." Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat as she listened to the venom in Mark's words, his casual cruelty, and the way he belittled her in front of others. He had reduced her to nothing but a stereotype, a token black woman, a person to be mocked and ridiculed for daring to exist in spaces that were supposedly reserved for others. And the worst part, his audience didn't just laugh at his words, they encouraged him. Elizabeth sat in stunned silence, her mind racing. How had this happened? How had someone with so little empathy been able to inflict so much harm so easily? And how had the people around him become complicit in the degradation of another human being? "This is unacceptable," Elizabeth said quietly, her voice low but filled with fury. "This is beyond anything I could have imagined." Her assistant, Emily, was still on the line. "We need to respond quickly, Elizabeth," she said, her voice trembling with urgency. "This could ruin you. The media is already picking up on it. People are calling for your resignation, saying you're just trying to make yourself a martyr." Elizabeth paused for a long moment, her thoughts swirling like a storm inside her head. She had fought against systemic racism for so long, but this was different. This was an attack on her very being. This wasn't just about politics, it was personal. "Send out a statement," Elizabeth said, her voice sharp with purpose. "I'm not going to back down. I'm not going to let them silence me. I'll show them that their words, his words, won't make me disappear. If they want a fight, they'll get one." Emily hesitated for a moment before responding. "Are you sure? This is going to get ugly. People are already saying some pretty terrible things about you." "I'm sure," Elizabeth replied firmly. "I've dealt with worse. Let them say whatever they want, but they'll know my name, and they'll know what I stand for." The following hours were a blur of phone calls, press releases, and strategic meetings. Elizabeth's team worked tirelessly to craft a response, but Elizabeth knew there would be no easy resolution. This wasn't just about defending herself. This was about taking a stand for the countless others who had been subjected to the same kind of discrimination, the same kind of humiliation, and had never had the platform or the voice to speak out. When the statement was ready, Elizabeth reviewed it carefully, her gaze scanning the words one last time before releasing it to the world. "I will not be silenced," the statement began. "The comments made by the waiter from that restaurant and the subsequent video mocking me are not just a personal affront. They are a reflection of the systemic racism that still exists in every corner of this society. The belief that a person can be treated as inferior based solely on their race, their age, or their background is not just an insult. It is a disease that we must eradicate. I will not allow the actions of one individual to undermine the progress we've made, or to silence the voices of those who continue to fight for equality and justice." Elizabeth didn't stop there. She called for a full investigation into the actions of the waiter and the staff at the restaurant. She demanded that the restaurant's management take responsibility for the environment they had allowed to fester. But more importantly, she made it clear that this was not just about her. It was about a culture that allowed hate to thrive unchecked. Within hours, the statement had gone viral. People from all walks of life, celebrities, activists, everyday citizens, rallied behind her, sharing their own experiences and demanding accountability. But as the public outcry grew, so did the voices of those who sought to tear her down. Some said Elizabeth was playing the victim. Others accused her of making the incident about herself, of inflating the situation for political gain. The attacks were harsh, but Elizabeth didn't let them deter her. She knew they were a distraction, meant to provoke her into a response that would undermine her message. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. She had faced worse in her life, far worse, and had come out stronger every time. Her resolve only hardened as the days wore on. The more they tried to bury her, the more they pushed her into a corner, the more determined she became to make sure they understood just how far she was willing to go. She wasn't going to be silenced. Not this time. She'd been knocked down before, but Elizabeth Montgomery was ready to rise again. This fight wasn't just hers anymore. It was for every person who had ever been treated like they didn't belong, and she was going to make sure their voices were heard. The battle had only just begun, and Elizabeth wasn't about to back down now. Days turned into weeks, and the firestorm surrounding Elizabeth only seemed to intensify. Every move she made was scrutinized, dissected by both the media and those who felt threatened by her rise. The backlash from her public statement had galvanized the racist factions lurking in society, while her supporters rallied behind her with fervor. Yet, the wounds from this battle were becoming deeper, sharper, more personal than any Elizabeth had ever anticipated. The world she once moved through so confidently, filled with political campaigns, policy proposals, and high-profile meetings, was now a place filled with shadows. The vitriol directed at her was no longer limited to anonymous comments or the occasional email. It was everywhere, in every room she entered, in every conversation she had. The subtle racism that had always existed just beneath the surface was now on full display, unashamed and unrelenting. At the office, the atmosphere had shifted. The usual buzz of productivity now felt more like an undercurrent of tension. Her assistants, her colleagues, were careful around her. No one knew how to act. Some were clearly uncomfortable in her presence, unsure how to engage with the woman at the center of the storm. It was as though they had all been forced to take sides, forced to choose whether to support her or distance themselves from the drama. Elizabeth had always known that people would question her, challenge her, but the way people started to avoid her, to treat her with thinly veiled disdain, was a new and painful experience. Her Parrot, which had been with her through countless battles, sat quietly on her shoulder, offering an odd comfort in the midst of the chaos. He was, as always, the one thing that remained unchanged in this ever-shifting landscape. Elizabeth sat at her desk, her fingers lightly tapping the wood, the silence in the room almost oppressive. The latest reports filled the screen in front of her, calls for her resignation, letters from those questioning her right to speak out, and endless threads of comments from people who accused her of playing the race card, of exaggerating the situation. But it wasn't just the messages from the general public that weighed heavily on her. It was the comments from her peers, the people who had once respected her, admired her for her work, now questioning whether her stance was too radical, whether she had truly been mistreated at the restaurant, whether she was making a mountain out of a molehill. The room was thick with the tension of her own thoughts, the weight of years spent pushing against the very structures she had dedicated her life to dismantling. She had climbed so high in the political world, fought so hard for a seat at the table. And yet it seemed that no matter how far she climbed, the world still saw her as an outsider, still saw her as someone who didn't belong. Elizabeth's phone buzzed on the desk, pulling her from her reverie. The message on the screen was from Emily, her assistant. "There's a new story online. It's not good. You should see it." Elizabeth sighed and opened the link. The article, written by a well-known columnist, was already gaining traction. The headline was simple but loaded. Elizabeth Montgomery, the politician who uses race for personal gain. Her stomach twisted as she read the first few paragraphs. The columnist painted her as someone who had capitalized on her race, who had used the restaurant incident as a springboard for her own agenda. The article went on to accuse her of exaggerating the severity of the situation, of manipulating the media to garner sympathy. It painted her as an opportunist, someone who had turned a simple service encounter into a political spectacle. The words burned, and the sense of isolation she'd been feeling grew more pronounced. It wasn't just the ignorant people online. It was now the well-respected writers, the influential commentators, The very people who had once praised her for her work, who were turning on her. It was as though they wanted her to conform, to remain within the boundaries of the acceptable level of activism. They wanted her to stay quiet, to play by the rules of a system that had never truly worked for people like her. She put the phone down and leaned back in her chair, taking a deep breath. She had to stay calm. She had to stay focused. This was what they wanted, to break her, to make her question herself. They thought they could silence her by mocking her, by undermining her integrity. But Elizabeth Montgomery had never been easily broken. She would not let them define her. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts, and Emily entered, her face strained but composed. "There's more," she said softly. "It's not just the column. Someone's leaked some old footage from one of your speeches. They're calling it divisive, saying you're fueling more hate, more division." Elizabeth felt a rush of frustration but suppressed it. "It's the same playbook, isn't it?" she said, more to herself than to Emily. "Take everything I've done, every speech I've given, every policy I've fought for, and twist it. Make it seem like I'm the problem. Make it seem like I'm the one causing the division." Emily nodded, her eyes reflecting the same exhaustion that Elizabeth was feeling. "They're attacking your credibility. They're trying to make you seem like a radical, someone who can't be trusted." Elizabeth stood up slowly, her hands clenched at her sides. She walked over to the window, looking out over the city, her mind racing. She'd always known this fight would be hard, but now it felt like an impossible battle. She wasn't just fighting for policy change anymore. She was fighting for her right to exist as a person of power, to exist in the spaces she had fought so hard to claim as her own. "I won't back down," she said firmly, turning back to Emily. "I won't let them make me the villain in this story. I know what I stand for. I know the difference between right and wrong, and I will make them see it." Emily gave a small, tired smile. "What's next then?" "We keep moving forward," Elizabeth replied, her voice strong despite the weariness creeping in. "I'm not going to let them tear me down. I'm not going to let them silence me. If they want to continue this fight, I'll meet them head on. I'll show them that I will never be intimidated by their hate." Elizabeth took a deep breath and picked up the phone again. She dialed her communications team. "We need to schedule another press conference," she said, her tone sharp. "It's time to take this fight to the next level." As the day wore on, the media continued to attack, but Elizabeth didn't falter. Every statement they made, every new piece of misinformation that was spread, only fueled her determination. She would not be the one to retreat into silence. She would not be the one to back down. Her voice would not be stifled by those who wished to keep the system intact. Later that evening, as Elizabeth prepared for the press conference, she found herself standing before the mirror, adjusting her appearance, taking a deep breath. She knew what was coming. She had seen the hate, the mockery, the people who would do anything to tear her down. But she also knew that she had something far more powerful than any of them: the truth. As she walked into the conference room, the cameras flashed and the voices of the reporters filled the air. But Elizabeth didn't feel the usual unease. This wasn't about her anymore. This wasn't about one woman's fight for respect. This was about the larger struggle for justice, for equality, for the right to be seen as human in a world that had spent far too long trying to erase people like her. She stepped to the podium, the weight of the moment settling in her chest, but she didn't let it break her. The room was silent as she began to speak. "I'm here today not because of an incident at a restaurant. I'm here because we are at a crossroads in this country. A crossroads where we either continue to ignore the systemic racism that runs through our institutions, or we confront it head on. We cannot keep pretending that things are getting better while our communities are still being torn apart. We cannot pretend that the work is done when people like me are still being treated like we don't belong. This fight is not just mine. It's all of ours." Her words echoed through the room, the reporters silent as they listened to her. Elizabeth wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been dismissed, who had ever been made to feel small, who had ever been humiliated because of the color of their skin. And as long as she had breath in her body, she would not let that fight go unnoticed. This was just the beginning. And no matter how many they sent to tear her down, Elizabeth Montgomery was ready to rise again. The days after the press conference passed in a blur of headlines, public debates, and private phone calls. Elizabeth's every move, every word was analysed, critiqued, and twisted into something that could either be seen as a victory or a defeat. The media circus surrounding her was relentless, but Elizabeth was used to being in the eye of a storm. This was nothing new to her, or so she thought. But it wasn't just the public scrutiny or the online backlash that weighed on her. It was the quiet, insidious racism she encountered in the private spaces. Spaces where people smiled to her face, but she could feel the subtle discomfort underneath their smiles, the cautious politeness that only reinforced the distance they wanted to keep between her and themselves. It was a chilling reminder that for all her success, for all the power she had accumulated, she was still not fully accepted. The phone calls continued to come, some supportive, others hostile. The emails were much the same. There were those who offered words of encouragement, who rallied behind her fight, and there were those who sought only to tear her down. She had never been afraid of a fight. In fact, she had spent her entire life fighting for her place in a world that didn't want her to have one. But this time, there was something different. The anger, the vitriol. This wasn't just about politics. It was about a fundamental challenge to her right to exist in the spaces she had fought so hard to be a part of. The racism was not subtle anymore. It was open, loud, and it was coming from every direction. Elizabeth sat in her office late one evening, looking over some policy proposals she had been drafting. The paperwork in front of her blurred together as her mind wandered. The parrot sat quietly in the corner of the room, seemingly content while she was anything but. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Emily, her assistant. "Elizabeth, there's something you need to see. It's happening again. The protests at the restaurant. Someone posted new footage. It's viral." Elizabeth's stomach tightened. She knew what that meant. The last thing she needed was another video, a new round of fuel to the fire, another attempt to discredit her. But she couldn't ignore it. Not now. Not when everything she had fought for was on the line. The footage appeared on her screen moments later. She watched, her heart sinking with each passing second. The video wasn't like the first one where Mark, the waiter, had mocked her to his friends. This one was different. It was a clip of a rally. Hundreds of people gathered in front of the restaurant, holding signs and chanting. They weren't protesting for justice. They were protesting against her. The signs read, "Stop the divisive politician and don't let her use race for attention." There were voices in the background, some familiar, some not. A couple of reporters interviewed people in the crowd, and Elizabeth could hear the same tired rhetoric being repeated. "She's just trying to make everything about race. Why can't we just let things go? We're all equal now. Why can't she see that?" The video felt like a slap in the face. It wasn't the first time Elizabeth had faced a protest, but it was the first time she had been so openly targeted by such a large group. The messages were clear. They didn't just want her to step back. They wanted her erased. Elizabeth turned off her phone and leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. This wasn't just about one man's actions anymore. It was a concerted effort, a coordinated push to silence her, to make her the villain in this story. But she wouldn't be silenced. She couldn't afford to be. The next day, as Elizabeth prepared for another round of media interviews, she found herself confronted by something unexpected. She was meeting with a small group of key political figures in her office to discuss the direction of the racial equality bill she had been pushing for months. There were two men in the room who had been allies for years, men she trusted. But today, there was a coolness in their demeanor that she couldn't ignore. "I'm not sure we can continue supporting you in this," one of them said, his voice measured but firm. "You've become too divisive. We're all for equality, but your recent statements, your involvement in the restaurant incident, it's drawing too much attention to you, and it's damaging our cause." Elizabeth's stomach churned, and she could feel her pulse quicken. She knew what this meant. These men, who had once been allies in her fight, were now questioning her commitment, questioning her tactics. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice calm but sharp, betraying none of the hurt that she felt inside. "I'm saying that your actions have consequences," the other man chimed in, glancing nervously at his colleague. "We need to be strategic about how we approach these issues. We can't afford to alienate potential allies. You've made it too personal. You've given them the ammunition to attack." Elizabeth could feel the sting of betrayal in the words, but she didn't allow herself to show it. "I've spent my life fighting for this," she said slowly, "and I won't let anyone take this from me. Not now, not after all the progress we've made. If you want to distance yourselves from me, that's your choice. But I won't back down. I won't be silenced." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Elizabeth could feel the weight of their judgment, their reluctance to stand by her when she needed them most. But she couldn't let their doubts shake her resolve. She had spent too long navigating a world that didn't want her in it to let them dictate her path now. As the meeting ended, Elizabeth stood up, her mind racing with the implications of what had just happened. She had always known that people would abandon her when the fight got too hard. But this felt different. This wasn't just about policy or the politics of the moment. This was about her very identity, her right to exist in a space that had always been reserved for others. Outside the office, the protests grew louder. The chants from the rally outside echoed in her mind. She had expected resistance, but this was something deeper, more personal. It wasn't just the casual racism that she had faced in her life. It was the racism that said she didn't belong, that she had no place in the world she had fought so hard to be a part of. She left the office that evening, the world outside colder than it had ever felt before. As she walked to her car, she could see the protesters gathered, shouting slogans, their faces filled with anger and disdain. They were no longer just protesting her actions, they were protesting her very existence. Elizabeth's mind raced as she climbed into her car, her thoughts swirling like a storm. She had known that taking this fight on would make her a target, but she hadn't expected it to feel so isolating. It was one thing to fight for change. It was another to be vilified for simply demanding respect. As the car sped through the streets, Elizabeth realized that the fight was far from over. But she was no longer fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person who had been dismissed, who had been told that they didn't belong. The racism she faced wasn't just personal. It was a reflection of the larger system, a system that needed to be torn down. And Elizabeth Montgomery was just the person to do it. The road ahead would be long and it would be difficult, but she had faced far worse in her life. She would face this too, because the world needed to hear her story. The world needed to see her fight, and she wasn't about to stop now. Days turned into weeks, and the pressure on Elizabeth only seemed to increase. The media frenzy surrounding her stance on the restaurant incident had evolved into something far more dangerous than a simple backlash. What began as an attack on her integrity had spiraled into an all-out assault on her character, her past, and her very identity. It wasn't just the vitriol of social media. It was in the comments from her colleagues, those who had once been her allies, now questioning her actions and casting doubts on her motives. It was in the whispered conversations she overheard in hallways, the sideways glances from staff members who had once looked to her as a leader. It was in the subtle but unmistakable shift in the way people treated her in meetings, an avoidance of eye contact, the polite but distant greetings, the uncomfortable silences when she spoke. Elizabeth had known this would be difficult. She had known that she would face resistance, but the emotional toll of watching her peers and colleagues turn their backs on her, seeing them start to distance themselves from her fight, was something she hadn't fully prepared for. The worst part was the subtle racism, the kind that didn't always appear in blatant slurs or obvious actions, but in the little things, the dismissive glances, the unsolicited advice to tone down her rhetoric, the way her words were distorted, twisted, and taken out of context. She had fought for so long to be seen as a legitimate political figure, to be recognized for her work and her accomplishments, not just the color of her skin. But now, it felt like the world was reminding her that she would always be different. She would always be other. The media had latched onto the story like a pack of wolves, circling around her every move. The attacks came in all forms, articles calling her a race baiter, political pundits on TV calling her too radical, and a flood of online posts accusing her of turning a simple restaurant incident into a political spectacle. But what really cut deep were the words of her own colleagues, those she had worked beside for years. They had once respected her for her drive, her ability to navigate the political world with grace and intelligence. But now, they were using her as a cautionary tale. She was the angry black woman, the one who had been too quick to jump to conclusions, the one who had made something out of nothing. The distance between her and the rest of the political world grew wider every day. And Elizabeth, for all her strength, could feel the isolation settling in. The tipping point came one afternoon when a letter arrived at her office. It was handwritten, the words scrawled hastily on the page. It was unsigned, but the message was clear. "You're nothing but a problem. You always have been. No one wants to listen to your whining anymore. Go back to your own kind and leave us alone." Elizabeth had seen her fair share of hate, but the ugliness of the letter left her shaken. It was a direct attack on everything she was, everything she stood for. The words were not just racist, they were deeply personal, an attempt to strip her of her identity and force her into the box that society had assigned to her. To them, she was a problem, a nuisance to be removed. She crumpled the letter in her fist, staring at it for a long moment. The anger inside her swelled, but she didn't let it spill over. Instead, she set the letter down carefully on her desk, her fingers tracing the edges of the paper as she took a deep breath. She had known that people would try to tear her down, but this was something different. This was an attempt to erase her, to reduce her to nothing more than a stereotype, to make her feel like she didn't belong. It was an attack on her very essence, her right to be seen as an equal. And for a moment, just a moment, it almost succeeded, but not today. Elizabeth stood up, the letter forgotten on the desk. She had spent too long fighting against forces that wanted to see her fall. She had been knocked down, humiliated, and pushed aside her entire life. But she had never stayed down, and she wasn't about to start now. The phone buzzed on her desk and she answered quickly. It was Emily again, her voice filled with urgency. "Elizabeth, there's something you need to see. It's happening now, online, and the media is picking it up. It's about the video." Elizabeth's stomach twisted. Another video. She had hoped this would die down, that the story would fade, but it seemed like they were just getting started. "What's this one about?" Elizabeth asked, her voice calm despite the dread building inside her. Emily paused before speaking. "It's more footage, this time of the protesters outside the restaurant. It's spreading fast, and the things they're saying, it's worse than before. They're calling for people to take action against you, to protest your policies. They're claiming you're a threat to the fabric of society." Elizabeth closed her eyes, her fingers gripping the edge of her desk. She had expected it, but hearing the words out loud hit harder than she had anticipated. "I'll look at it," she said, her voice steady but filled with the weight of what was to come. "Thanks, Emily." After hanging up, Elizabeth turned to her computer and opened the link that Emily had sent. The footage was raw, filmed from multiple angles. Protesters were shouting, holding signs and marching in front of the restaurant where she had been so publicly humiliated. The camera zoomed in on a group of men, their faces angry, their voices filled with hatred. The signs they held were bold and aggressive, many of them focused on attacking Elizabeth personally. "Radical politician," one of the signs read. "Racism isn't a weapon," another sign read. "Keep politics out of my food." But what struck Elizabeth most were the words of the protesters themselves, words she could hear through the chants and the noise. They weren't just angry with her stance on racism. They were angry that she had the audacity to stand up at all. One man was caught on film yelling, "She's just trying to divide us all. She doesn't belong in this country, with her demands and her divisive policies." It was the same old argument. She wasn't just a person. They saw her as a symbol of everything they hated. To them, she represented the end of a system that had worked for them for years. She represented change, and change was a threat. Elizabeth watched the video to the end, her eyes fixed on the screen, her jaw tight. She had never backed down from a challenge in her life. But this was different. The hate, the vitriol, it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everything she represented, everything she had worked for. And it was growing, but she wouldn't let them win. She took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. This wasn't just an attack on her, this was an attack on all of them, the people who had been ignored, dismissed, or ridiculed for too long. It was an attack on everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. And she wasn't going to let it stand. Elizabeth turned off her computer and grabbed her coat. She had a meeting to attend, but more importantly, she had something she needed to say. It was time to take action. The media had turned her into the villain, but she wouldn't let them define her anymore. She wouldn't let them reduce her to a caricature. She would fight back, harder than ever before. She would make them see her for who she really was, a force to be reckoned with. A politician, yes, but more importantly, a person who would never be silenced. She had been pushed to the edge, but she wasn't going to fall. Not this time. Not ever. As she stepped out of her office and into the hallway, The sound of her heels clicking against the floor echoed in the silence. It was time to make her move. She wasn't just going to stand by and let them erase everything she had worked for. She was going to fight, every step of the way. The battle was far from over, and this time, Elizabeth Montgomery was ready to win. The weeks following Elizabeth's decision to stand firm had only deepened the storm swirling around her. What had started as a viral moment, her refusal to be silenced after the restaurant incident, had turned into an unrelenting political and personal struggle. The waves of media attention that followed her statement only seemed to heighten the hate directed at her, but also ignited a firestorm of support. The lines between those who supported her and those who condemned her had never been so clearly drawn. And as the days passed, she was increasingly aware of the heavy toll the conflict was taking on her life. The social media campaigns against her had grown louder and more organized. Protesters continued to rally against her, calling her out in the streets, sending constant waves of hate in her direction. As the protests became more widespread, they no longer remained confined to the restaurant or a small handful of people. Every public appearance she made now seemed to have an air of hostility about it. But Elizabeth wasn't one to back down. She had spent too many years working to get to where she was, building a platform from nothing, only to have it all erased by people who couldn't tolerate the idea of equality. She knew her fight was about more than just a single incident. It was a fight to make sure the marginalized were heard, and that her voice would not be drowned out by a system built to silence it. She sat in her office late one night, the dim light of the desk lamp illuminating her weary face. The words of the protesters rang in her ears, their angry chants still echoing from the video she had watched days earlier. They didn't just want her to be quiet, they wanted her erased, to be nothing more than an afterthought in the larger political machine. But Elizabeth would not let them win. Her phone buzzed on the desk. She glanced at it, her heart sinking as she saw the name, Emily. Elizabeth answered immediately. "What's happening?" "Elizabeth," Emily said, her voice strained. "There's been another video posted. Someone from the restaurant, one of the servers, has shared another clip. It's going viral. This time it's worse than before. He's mocking you even more, and they're saying things about your past now." Elizabeth stiffened, her breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" "I don't know exactly yet, but they're digging into your history. Some old footage from when you were first starting in politics. They're trying to paint you as a radical from the start. There's talk of you being too aggressive, too confrontational. They're trying to discredit you, Elizabeth." Elizabeth leaned back in her chair, a deep sigh escaping her lips. The weight of the moment seemed to settle on her chest. She had always known this would be part of the battle. They would never accept her. The system had never been built for people like her. The minute she started to push for real change, to demand equality, she had known the forces that had long been in place to uphold the status quo would fight back. "They're attacking my character now, aren't they?" Elizabeth said, her voice low but resolute. "They want to discredit me, make me out to be the villain. They'll say I'm too much of a threat to their carefully constructed world." Emily paused on the other end of the line before replying. "Yes, that's exactly it. They're doing everything they can to make you look like an outsider. But you don't have to let them succeed." Elizabeth stood up, walking slowly to the window of her office. She looked out over the city, its towering buildings casting long shadows as the lights of the streets flickered below. This was her city. She had worked tirelessly to make her voice heard, to challenge the systemic inequalities that plagued it, and now they were trying to tear it all down. But she wouldn't let them. Not now. Not when everything she had worked for, everything she had fought for, was at risk. "Emily," Elizabeth said firmly, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that was creeping in. "I'm not backing down. This is just another attempt to push me to the sidelines. If they think they can silence me with a few videos or some nasty comments, they're wrong." Emily's voice held a note of relief. "I knew you'd say that. What do you want to do next?" Elizabeth took a deep breath, her resolve solidifying. "We need to take this to the next level. It's time to stop letting them define the narrative. We need to show the world who I really am and what this fight is truly about. It's time to push forward, even harder." The next day, Elizabeth's team went into overdrive. They issued a public statement calling out the harassment and personal attacks, but more importantly, they laid out the larger implications of the campaign against her. This wasn't just about a single moment. This was about the ongoing marginalization of people of color, the systemic racism that had shaped every corner of the political landscape. "We will not be silenced," Elizabeth said in the statement. "We will not allow a system that has long been built to suppress and demean marginalized voices to continue. This attack on me is not about me. It is about every single person who has ever been made to feel small. It is about the countless individuals who face discrimination every single day. If they want to destroy me to keep their power, they can try. But I will not be moved. I will fight for what's right, for those who are still being silenced, for the ones who cannot speak for themselves." The response was immediate. Her statement garnered widespread support from the communities that had long been fighting for equality. The hashtags and the calls to action spread like wildfire across social media, urging people to speak out against the systemic racism that had been exposed by the attack on Elizabeth. The fight had shifted into something bigger than just one person's struggle. This was a fight for all the people who had been treated as inferior, for all the people who had been excluded from the table, their voices drowned out by the powerful. But as the support grew, so did the hate. Videos of Elizabeth continued to surface, many of them focused on tearing down her past, questioning her every decision, every speech she had ever made. The protesters outside her office grew louder, their chants more aggressive. "Radical politician," they shouted, "unfit for office, unfit to lead." The racism was impossible to ignore. It was no longer subtle. It was out in the open, in full view for everyone to see. The protesters called her a troublemaker, a danger to society, someone who had no place in the world they inhabited. They wanted to push her back into the margins, to silence her once and for all. But Elizabeth wasn't backing down. She had faced much worse before. She had been the target of racist attacks since the beginning of her political career. Every step she had taken towards success had been met with resistance, met with those who sought to tear her down. This, however, was different. The racism she was facing now wasn't just about her. It was about the progress she represented. It was about the system that was fighting to stay in power, fighting to preserve the status quo at all costs. She knew what was at stake. And more than ever, she knew that this was her moment to make a stand. Not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. For everyone who had ever been told that their voice didn't matter. In the face of all the hate, all the lies, and the personal attacks, Elizabeth stood tall. Her heart ached with the weight of it, but she was determined to see it through. There was no turning back now. The fight had only just begun, and she was ready to win it. The months had been long and exhausting. Elizabeth's resolve had been tested time and time again, but each challenge had only hardened her spirit. The personal attacks, the protests, the smear campaigns, they had all served as a constant reminder of the battle she was fighting, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been dismissed, humiliated, or silenced. She had been vilified by the media, mocked by her peers, and belittled by those who sought to maintain the systems of oppression that had long controlled the country. Yet, through it all, she stood firm. She knew that the fight for racial equality wasn't just a political issue, it was a human issue, and it was one she couldn't afford to walk away from. But even Elizabeth, with all her strength and experience, felt the weight of the battle growing heavier each day. The constant barrage of hate, the whispers behind closed doors, the disdain in the eyes of people who once respected her. It was enough to break even the strongest of wills. There were nights when she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the noise of the world pressing in from all sides, wondering if it was all worth it. The protests had only grown more intense. The crowds outside her office and her home had become an almost constant presence. The signs they carried, the chants they shouted, the insults they hurled, they had become a part of her daily life. It was no longer just about the restaurant incident. It was about everything she represented, the challenge to the status quo, the demand for a system that treated people equally, the audacity of a black woman refusing to shrink into the background. As she walked into her office one morning, Elizabeth felt the familiar wave of exhaustion wash over her. She had been in meetings all day, meeting with supporters, negotiating policy, trying to keep the machine of progress moving forward despite the relentless attacks. But this time, something was different. Something had shifted in the air. Her assistant, Emily, was waiting for her in the lobby, her face pale. Elizabeth could see the worry etched in her features as she approached. "Elizabeth, we've got a problem," Emily said quietly, her voice shaking with barely contained anxiety. "What's going on?" Elizabeth asked, her stomach tightening. They've released more footage," Emily said, her words almost breathless. "This time it's worse. It's a compilation of every interview you've ever given, every speech, every moment when you've stood up for racial equality. They've taken it all and twisted it, claiming you're inciting violence, calling you a danger to society. They're saying your very presence in politics is dividing the country." Elizabeth's heart sank. She knew that this was coming. The more she pushed, the harder they would fight back. But the sheer ugliness of it still caught her off guard. It wasn't just about fighting for equality anymore. It was about fighting to preserve her dignity, her right to exist in these spaces without being reduced to nothing more than a stereotype. "They're trying to destroy you, Elizabeth," Emily said, her voice breaking. "They're taking everything they can and turning it against you. People are calling for your resignation, saying you've become a liability. They've even started organizing petitions." Elizabeth's mind raced. The weight of the moment felt suffocating. This wasn't just about a few misguided individuals. It was a coordinated effort to erase everything she had worked for. But Elizabeth had faced this before. She had seen this play out time and time again throughout history. The same hate, the same fear, the same attempts to silence those who demanded justice. But she had never been one to back down. She wouldn't start now. "Set up a press conference," Elizabeth said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "It's time to make it clear that I'm not going anywhere. I will not be intimidated, and neither will the people who stand with me." The press conference was scheduled for the next day. Elizabeth knew this would be the turning point. She had to use this moment, not just to defend herself, but to reaffirm everything she stood for. This wasn't just about one woman. This was about the millions of voices that had been silenced, the generations of people who had been told they didn't matter. As she stood before the gathered crowd of reporters, cameras flashing, microphones held out in front of her, Elizabeth felt a sense of calm wash over her. She had fought too long, had endured too much to be brought down by the lies and hatred of those who sought to keep the world as it was. She had never been afraid of a challenge, and this was the greatest challenge of her life. She took a deep breath and began to speak. "I stand here today, not as a politician, not as a public figure, but as a woman who refuses to be silenced. They want me to retreat. They want me to step back and apologize for speaking out against the injustices that have plagued this country for centuries. But I will not apologize. I will not shrink. I will not let them erase my voice." Elizabeth paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. The reporters were silent, waiting for her to continue. "The truth is, we have a choice," she said, her voice rising with intensity. "We can continue to ignore the systems that keep people like me, and so many others, on the fringes of society. Or we can face the uncomfortable truth that racism, discrimination, and inequality still run rampant in every corner of this country. It's not just the overt acts of hate. It's in the subtle biases, the microaggressions, the dismissals of people who don't fit into a narrow, outdated definition of what success looks like. It's in the way people like me are treated differently just because of the color of our skin." The crowd was rapt, hanging on her every word. Elizabeth could feel the weight of history pressing on her shoulders. This was her moment. "I have spent my life fighting for equality," she continued, her voice steady and unwavering. "I have spent my life pushing for policies that will lift up those who have been held down for far too long. And I will continue to fight. I will continue to stand up, not just for myself, but for every person who has been told they don't belong. For every person who has been made to feel like they are less than. I will stand up for the voices that have been silenced by fear and hate." A reporter raised their hand and Elizabeth nodded, signaling them to ask their question. "Do you think you've become a symbol of division?" the reporter asked. "Do you think you've contributed to the growing political rift in the country?" Elizabeth didn't hesitate. "No," she said firmly. "What I've done is show people the truth that this country cannot move forward if we continue to pretend that inequality doesn't exist. We cannot move forward if we allow racism and hate to continue running rampant in every institution. This isn't about division, it's about unity. It's about coming together to build a better world, where everyone, no matter their race, their background, their identity, can have an equal shot at success. She could see the shift in the room. The reporters who had come to challenge her, to tear her down, were now listening with respect, their questions less hostile. This wasn't the angry, divisive woman they had tried to portray. This was a woman who knew exactly what she was fighting for, and why. Elizabeth paused, her gaze sweeping across the room. She had given everything to this fight, and she wasn't done yet. The truth is, she said softly, we all have a role to play in this fight. Whether you're a politician, a teacher, a parent, or a student, we all have the power to make a difference. The question is, are we willing to face the uncomfortable truths and do the work to make things better? I am, and I will keep fighting, no matter what. As she finished her speech, the room was silent. The reporters were no longer hostile. They were listening, truly listening, to the words she had spoken. For the first time in a long time, Elizabeth felt like she was being heard. She left the press conference with a renewed sense of purpose. The fight wasn't over, and she knew it would never be easy. But in that moment, she knew something had shifted. She had made her stand, and the world had seen it. She would never be erased, and she would never stop fighting for what was right. The battle for equality was far from over, but Elizabeth Montgomery was not backing down. She would stand strong, as she always had, for herself, for her community, and for every person who had ever been told they didn't matter. This was her fight, and she was going to win. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. What do you think about the struggles Elizabeth faced and the challenges of fighting against systemic racism? Have you experienced similar situations in your own life? Your feedback means so much to us, and we deeply appreciate every one of you who takes the time to share your thoughts. If you enjoyed the story, please consider subscribing and liking the video to help us continue creating more content. And don't forget to share it with others who might find it impactful. You're incredibly important to us, and we value your support. Before you go, please leave a comment with the phrase, "Strength in Adversity," so we know you've listened all the way to the end. Have a wonderful day.